Hello, this is Kalman Andrassy, and this is Intercultural Relations. And today we're going to be discussing perception, values, and cultural patterns for communication as the roadmap for individual behavior. So, perception is how we make sense of the physical and the social world. It is how we construct our reality and our place in it. Perception is something that is learned. It is also culturally determined, and it also tends to be consistent, inaccurate, and selective. I'd like to talk a little bit about all of that. So what is it that I mean by that? Well, perception is learned because life's experience teaches us to see the world in a particular way. And it is culture that teaches us the meaning behind most of those experiences. So once you perceive and accept something, that interpretation is generally going to be very resistant to change. So you view the world through a very subjective lens. It's going to be influenced by your culture and your values and your personal experiences. So ultimately, you see what it is that you want to see, or what you expect to see, perhaps, if not directly what you're intending to see. And, because there's so many different stimuli surrounding you simultaneously at all times, competing for your attention, you tend to focus on select information and filter out the rest. Right? And that's ultimately what brings us to a discussion about beliefs and belief systems. Okay? So you can think of beliefs as concepts or ideas that individuals or social groups hold to be true. And beliefs are usually reflected in one's actions and communication behaviors, regardless of evidence or the veracity or the truth behind the communication. Beliefs are the very foundation for individual and collective actions, which inform a culture of the concepts of right and wrong, or appropriate and inappropriate, to establish essentially normative modes of behavior. Okay? So beliefs are the outward manifestation of our internalized beliefs and values. So, as an example, if you believe that college will be a better pathway for your life, you will tend to value education, and your behaviors will be that in which you apply yourself to your studies. Okay? So here are some questions to ask yourself. Is decision making in your culture more individualistic, or does it value collectiveness? What is valued more, your own thoughts or some sort of a consensus with other people? How do people express respect and show gratitude or politeness in your culture? Are there any specific gestures or phrases or actions that are deemed to be respectful? How do you perceive time in your culture? Is it important for you to be on time, or is there a degree of flexibility in that regard? And are there any cultural taboos that should be avoided in communication or interaction in your own culture? So that being said, remember that you are more than just your culture and your cultural patterns. And while they might be integrated, they can be contradictory. And, to a pretty significant degree, your own personal actions oftentimes reflect something that may go against the general nature of the cultural norms that are reflected in your society. Okay, so here is a breakdown. These are Cole's values that Americans live by, looking at 13 points in American US culture that contrasts with many of its foreign counterparts. So in the United States, there is a general belief that the individual is quintessential in all of the decision making that takes place. And oftentimes it goes above the beliefs of the collective. And there's a general belief that individuals have personal control over their environment to a pretty significant extent. And this contrasts by a somewhat foreign seeming perspective to many Americans, which is the notion of fate, that you have no control over the environment and that you are not able to uh, not able to get away from what fate has in store for you. Okay? Americans value change over tradition. They value being on the cutting edge and being progressive in terms of development, as opposed to generally accepting more conservative traditional values about the way that the world works. Americans value time and control over time, oftentimes over the notion of human interaction. In many other societies, it would be deemed appropriate to spend additional time with your spouse or a significant other if it means being late to a meeting or something along those lines. That is generally frowned upon in American society, where punctuality is, to a pretty significant degree, an important characteristic to possess. The general notion of equality is expected and respected in American society. It doesn't matter who you're interacting with, generally speaking, your interactions with that individual are intended to put you on equal footing with one another, whereas hierarchy, rank, and status tend to be of quintessential importance in other societies around the world. Individualism and privacy are hallmarks of American society as well, as opposed to the notion of group welfare coming from other parts of the world as well. Individuals in the United States tend to be very preoccupied with the notion of self-help and self-improvement, doing everything that you can to achieve everything that you want to in life. And that contrasts sharply with the notion of birthright inheritance, where people are essentially born into their wealth, their status, and their general relative level of power. The US values competition over cooperation to a pretty significant degree. If you look at American television shows, there's a lot of competitive shows. Baking shows and whatnot in America are competitive, where people are cutthroat and trying to bake the best cake, in sharp contrast to others. Whereas you contrast that with the great British baking show, and it's all about cooperation and encouraging one another to a significant extent, rather than proving and showing who is the best. Americans tend to be very future oriented, meaning they are looking to what is going to happen in the future, as opposed to looking back at the past as a source of inspiration and as a means to motivate their next actions. The American society tends to be very action or work oriented, rather than simply being oriented on being. A lot of people in the United States identify themselves with regard to their professions, for example, or their role within a household, as opposed to simply being an individual within that society. Americans tend to favor informality over formality, right? Individuals in the United States are far more comfortable dressing down in many different occasions than would normally be the case in many other countries. Americans tend to favor directness, openness, and honesty, as opposed to indirectness, ritual, and face. So we're going to be talking about face here in a little bit as well. But the idea of saving face for individuals, not necessarily expressing your true opinions of the work that somebody has done or actions taken by an individual, instead beating around the bush, as we say in American society, to save that person a modicum of dignity and respect. Americans tend to favor practicality and efficiency over idealism. Americans care about what can get done more so than what is possible. And while there is a notion of idealism that is respected in American society, uh, Americans demand results ultimately over simply ideals and the notion of what could be or what could have been. Furthermore, the US tends to value materialism and acquisitiveness. There is a big emphasis on an individual's income, for example, as a determinant of their status, whereas spiritualism and the notion of detachment might be the favored course of action in other countries, where there is much less of an emphasis on the material world and the acquisition of resources and income and things of that nature. Okay, so in the US, control over nature is considered normal and it is considered right. For Americans, things like changing jobs is an accepted norm and a means of personal advancement and embracing new challenges, whereas in other societies, perhaps none quite as pronounced as in Japan, the general notion of quitting a job and then subsequently getting another job is just something that is, almost taboo to a significant degree. It's almost seen as a betrayal to a lot of organizations that are out there and a lot of managers. Like, how could you possibly leave this job that has, provided you with so much material benefit and everything in the past? How can you go on to a new job where you're starting anew? So that is definitely something that is different about American society than other societies as well. Next up, looking at different value dimensions and essentially what the spectrum is of how different cultures may orient themselves in terms of values that drive their interactions within the society. So the first spectrum is the notion of individualism to collectivism. How much of an emphasis is there on individual liberty, individual rights, favoring the individual over the collective, the group, the greatest good for the largest number of individuals, right? American society is not necessarily utilitarian in its approach to a significant degree, but rather emphasizes what is good for the individual, a lot more of a focus on what is in it for somebody that is participating within the social context. What's in it for me, basically. Uncertainty avoidance is another spectrum. Some individuals tend to prefer to be very certain before they take actions versus having a degree of uncertainty before taking any sort of an action that could potentially have some degree of risk. Power distance is another one. How far away do you keep from notions of power? Masculinity and femininity. How much of an embrace of general traditional notions of masculinity and femininity are embraced by society? Is there more of a focus on the long term or more of a focus on the short term and instant gratification? And is there more of an emphasis on indulgence or restraint? Is there a value in delayed gratification as opposed to getting what you want as quickly as possible? Okay. So if you really think about it, in the US, schedules tend to be very inflexible, right? And meeting times tend to be on time. Meetings work their way through some sort of a set agenda. and they tend to end very promptly. In other cultures, time is considered far more flexible, and things like spending time with somebody may take precedence over some sort of a set schedule. So, again, in the United States, again, equality is one of those constant themes of social relationships, and hierarchy is oftentimes a secondary consideration and really only applied in certain contexts, like maybe seating arrangements or in professional settings or things like that. Now, furthermore, in the US, individualism commands really so much influence in American society that it really gives rise to a number of other US values, such as personal initiatives and self reliance, and again, the general notion of equal opportunity being presented to all individuals. So, the importance that US Americans place on self help and personal achievements is sort of an outgrowth of the value of independence and of equality and individuality, which I think are really exemplified in commonly heard expressions in the US, like, be self reliant, stand on your own 2 feet, don't depend on others. And one that I don't really care for personally, but is used a lot, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? So there is this general degree that, if you're an American, you need to be able to be self sufficient and exist on your own without too much of an influence by outside forces. And furthermore, Americans really tend to favor and value competition and free enterprise, which is something that I think young people are essentially socialized into at a very early age. People in the US tend to think about the future and taking chances, and they tend to be very optimistic about what will come tomorrow. Uh, and that's kind of associated with American thinking in general. Work is almost a matter of morality and attractiveness to Americans. Leisure time is seen as a reward for hard work and an opportunity for individuals to relax and refresh following a period of very hard work. Another characteristic of the US is its pervasive sense of informality, in that people, regardless of their age or their rank or their wealth or their position in some sort of an organization, are oftentimes considered equals. And this, in turn, I think, is reflected in the culture of friendliness with others, including strangers, that might be a little bit uncommon in many other countries, right? If you go into some countries and somebody is very friendly, people see that as almost fake because it is not an element of their culture. Here in the US, there's sort of this expectation that everybody's my equal and we can all be friends, we can all get along with each other. And so there are far more interactions with strangers in American society than would necessarily be expected in many other foreign societies. And kind of bound to that, the language style in the United States, it's seen as very frank and direct and explicit. And, again, that's going to be reflective of the US emphasis on practicality and efficiency. And there's far more of a value of logic and objectivity over emotions and subjectivity in American communication styles, particularly in a professional setting. Which brings me here to Michael Minkov's monumentalism versus flex humility topic of discussion here. Monumentalism is essentially an idea that suggests that the extent to which members of a culture believe in and encourage interpersonal competition sets out the way that they behave under certain circumstances. And that's contrasted with flex humility, which is less rigid and more accepting of socially based compromise. So I think that to a significant degree, Minkoff here would argue that the United States tends to be more of a monumentalist country than a flex humility based country. But let's go ahead and compare and contrast some of these notions that, again, may be at odds with one another. So the idea of self-pride and self-promotion, I think that's definitely characteristic of American society, and just the general notion that people are always struggling and seeking to reach the highest heights that they possibly can. And that contrasts with the notion of humility that is seen as sort of the basis of the default in some social contexts and things like that. Self-concept is considered very consistent and fixed in a monumentalist society. I am a insert thing here, as opposed to a situational or more flexible, fluid self-concept that might be more popular and more of a flex humility kind of a culture. In a monumentalist society, the idea of the truth is considered absolute, whereas the truth is relative in a flex humility-based society. There is more of an emphasis on what is right and wrong, or what is true and not true, what is correct and incorrect in a monumentalist sort of society. There tends to be more of an absolutist cognition in monumentalism as opposed to a more holistic cognition, meaning that there is one way of achieving something as opposed to a more systemic and comprehensive approach to that sort of achievement. Religion is generally important in a monumentalist society. The general notion that you are favored by the very divine in the activities that you engage in, and that's part of the reason that you achieve the things that you do. It's why you see during the Oscars and the Emmys a lot of people, thanking their respective deities, or after a sporting event, people thanking Jesus and things like that in American society. Whereas in perhaps a more flex humility-based society, there is less of an emphasis on religion and the idea of being blessed by the divine. Interpersonal competition is valued in monumentalist societies, and definitely that's the case in American society, where there is quite a bit of competition in education, in sporting, and lots of other areas of day-to-day life. Whereas in societies that more emphasize flex humility, there is an interpersonal any interpersonal competition is potentially deemed to be problematic, with more opportunities for cooperation being sought than necessarily competitiveness. In many monumentalist societies, there's a lower value on education, whereas in flex humility societies, there's more of a higher value on education. And I think to some extent in the United States, this perhaps is a deviation from monumentalism to a pretty significant degree, since education is indeed very much valued in American society. But at the same time, you can also very easily point to anti-academic rhetoric in some elements of American society as well. So it's not necessarily a thing that is set in stone in this regard. Monumentalists oftentimes have difficulty in adapting to other cultures, whereas flex humility cultures often adapt very easily to other cultures. There is a very famous notion of the ugly American in traveling abroad, where at least this came about usually, I think, in the 1970s is where the idea first really slipped into the American lexicon. It's the idea of Americans that would travel to other cultures, sorry, and they would behave in ways that are unbecoming of that culture because their expectation was essentially what they got at home. And so if there was a deviation from the things that they would be essentially entitled to in their home countries, they would behave in a not so wonderful way, deemed to be the ugly American approach to things. So I think that is kind of reflective of that monumentalist perspective that some individuals may have in society. In monumentalist societies, suicide is considered taboo, whereas in flex humility societies, suicide is accepted as something that is a viable option for individuals. Basically, the idea in monumentalist societies is that you have to keep living, you have to continue and fight through the difficulties that you have because you have to be essentially a valuable member of society, and you can't do that if you're no longer around. Tipping is expected and prevalent in a lot of monumentalist societies, basically rewards for good work, whereas tipping is not expected or rarely done in more of the flex humility-based societies. So now let's talk a little bit about Kluckhohn and Strodbeck. They ask a series of questions. First and foremost, what is the character of human nature? What is the relation of humankind to nature in general, meaning animal life and plant life and things like that? What is the orientation that people within a culture have toward time? What is the value that is placed on activity as opposed to just idealism and thought? And what is the relationship of people to one another? Okay. So they basically come to these sorts of conclusions about these 5 questions. So again, things on sort of a spectrum. Human nature, there are some societies that think that humans are basically evil, some that find them to be a mixture of good and evil, and some that find them to be basically good. With regard to nature and humanity's role within nature, some believe that humans are subject to nature, some believe that humans must live in harmony with nature, and others feel that humans need to be masters of nature. As far as sense of time, there's an orientation to a large degree, either to the past or tradition, an orientation to the presence, living in the moment, or living in the future, which is the idea of what can I do next? What can be the next achievement that I have? As far as activities, it's a spectrum from being to doing. Individuals just being, they can be in a state of being, trying to manifest what they are becoming, or they can be focused on doing things. And then, of course, social relationships, they can be authoritarian, they can be group-based, or they can be very individualistic. And these are not new ideas. These are ideas that have been tossed around and entertained in social and political philosophy. You kind of see this, the idea of human nature, for example, you see that in the modern political and social philosophers, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, with different perspectives on how people behave in a state of nature, essentially, whether they are inherently evil or they are a mix of good and evil, or if they tend to be good but need society or civilization to make that happen. So, this is something that has been a topic of discussion and of philosophical exercise for a pretty significant period of time. Okay? And now let's take a look at Hall's high context and low context orientation. So coming to an understanding of a high context society versus a lower context society, and the idea of basically symbolism pervading through different types of society. So a high context society, most of the meaning that's going to be exchanged during any type of social interactions or encounters is often not going to be communicated through words. And these kinds of cultures tend to be very traditional, and they tend to be very attuned to their surroundings and are able to express and interpret emotions without specifically vocalizing those things. So meaning in a high context culture is conveyed through things like status, age, sex, education, family background, title, and affiliations, and things like that, and through an individual's informal friends and their associates. So there is a lot more to it than necessarily just the individual, but the context that is around you. So members of these groups often communicate in an indirect fashion and rely more on how something is said rather than what is said to kind of get the context and the meaning behind it. And we can kind of contrast that with a lower context culture, which typically has more considerable population diversity, tends to be able to compartmentalize interpersonal contacts, where there is a individual situation and context for each interaction that you take. So the verbal message that gets conveyed in interactions are going to contain most of the information, and very little is embedded in the context or the participant's nonverbal activity. Right? Everything is expressly stated in a more low context sort of society. Okay? So now let's turn our attention to a study done by the Globe on cultural dimensions and examining different ways in which social interaction and social context and social meaning kind of manifests. Okay, so we have a lot of different points here that we're going to be examining. So we're going to start with that notion of uncertainty avoidance, right? We talked about this a little bit earlier on, and that's the extent to which societal and organizational members work to reduce uncertainty about future events through the use of social norms, protocols, and established practices. What you see is what you get, and there's little left to chance, and there's a lot of organization put into how the future is ultimately going to be laid out and how it's going to play out. Power distance is the degree to which societal or organizational members acquiesce to the unequal distribution of power, right? Are there going to be contexts in which there are individuals higher up on the social hierarchy that influence events more than individuals that are lower on that social hierarchy, or is there more of a emphasis on equality, essentially? Societal collectivism is the degree to which the established social and organizational practices of, again, a group condone and reward collective actions and resource distribution. Is there more of an emphasis on everybody getting a piece of the pie, or is there more of an emphasis on the individual? Does the individual get rewarded for the amount of effort that they put into within a societal context? In-group collectivism is the degree of pride, loyalty, and interconnectedness that people have in their family or their organization. Just how much do individuals identify with that group, and just how much do they put into ensuring the success of that group? Then this last notion here is gender egalitarianism, and that's the degree to which a society or an organization minimizes the differences in gender roles and in gender inequality. So is there a sharp distinction between masculinity and femininity? Is there a sharp degree of differentiation between males and females in terms of what their expectations are for society? Moving along, assertiveness. So how assertive, confrontational, and aggressive are the members of a society or organization in their social interactions, right? How much do people step up to the plate and advocate on their behalf, or perhaps the behalf of the social context that they find themselves in? How future-oriented is a society? It's the extent to which people take part in future-oriented actions like planning and investing for the future and delaying gratification. Performance orientation. That's the degree to which a society or organization rewards members for improvement and excellence. Again, How much is the achievement that an individual is able to manifest treated as a social status or other type of benefit or contextual positive as opposed to just a normal element of that person's life. Humane orientation, the degree that a society or organization promotes and displays rewards of fairness, altruism, generosity, caring, and kindness towards others. So, how much is there this notion of an individual being fair and kind and very generous and giving within the context of the society? Okay. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of these different cultural patterns and how they manifest in different parts of the world. So we're going to go ahead and start with a comparison and a contrast of individualism versus collectivism. So countries like the United States and Canada tend to be very focused on individualism, whereas countries like China and Mexico, on the other hand, are more collectivist in their approach. So in the US and Canada, the focus tends to be on the individual, the idea of self-promotion and independence, and oftentimes the tasks that need to be accomplished are what dominates the relationships and the interactions that people have with one another. And of course, there's a sense of social obedience through a sense of guilt, where there is the expectation that somebody needs to contribute to society based on this idea of guilt. You have achieved so much, you need to give back, essentially. Whereas in collectivist societies, the focus is on group affiliation and self-criticism, and there's a degree of interdependency among all the individuals that are in that group. And so the relationship is what dominates the task. The accomplishment of goals and the accomplishment of tasks are secondary to the maintenance of the relationship. And social obedience is gained through a sense of shame, right? People belong to the group, and to deviate from that group would be a shameful act. The US and Canada tend to be more egalitarian, whereas Mexico and countries like India tend to be a little bit more hierarchical. So in the US and Canada, there's more of a notion of horizontal relationships where there is a degree of equality, whereas in hierarchical relationships, in hierarchical countries, there are vertical relationships where there is a person on the bottom, somebody on top of them, somebody on top of them, and somebody on top of them in terms of their social rank. In the US and Canada, subordinates are consulted, whereas in hierarchical societies, subordinates are informed. So in the US, the norm is to ask your colleagues for their input, whereas in Mexico and India, oftentimes the individuals in a position of power will tell their subordinates what's going to happen. And again, in the US and Canada, equality is sort of the expectation, and any deviation from that can actually be seen as something of an insult or an affront to certain individuals, whereas in places like Mexico and India, to a degree, inequality is an accepted part of different interactions. Low uncertainty avoidance in countries like Ireland and the United States versus high certainty avoidance in countries like Japan and Spain. Okay? In the US and Ireland, the notion is that change is normal and that change is good. Whereas in places like Japan and Spain, oftentimes change is seen as disruptive and is seen as negative. It's disliked by certain individuals in social contexts. In Ireland and the United States, there are fewer behavioral protocols, whereas in places like Japan and Spain, there are far more behavioral protocols and expectations placed on certain social interactions. Ireland and the US have greater cultural diversity, whereas Japan and Spain, to a large degree, have less cultural diversity and are more monocultural or homogenous in terms of their social setups. Now, in terms of time recognition, this is a very interesting distinction between different countries. So, in places that are monochronic, like Germany and definitely to a lesser degree the United States, and that contrasts with polychronic societies like uh, many of the Arab countries and African countries as well. In places like Germany and the United States, time is considered very linear and segmented. Usually there's a lot of scheduling that is broken down into 1 hour, 30-minute, or 15-minute intervals. And these are the things that we need to accomplish during this time period. Whereas in polychronic societies, time is a little bit more flexible, right? The focus is on a single task in many monochronic societies, whereas in polychronic societies, there's a lot of juggling of multiple tasks happening. And in monochronic societies, there's an adherence to schedules, whereas in polychronic societies, there are weak ties to schedules. Now, I think to a significant degree, Germany and the United States are varying levels of monochronic expression. I think that in Germany, there is a lot more of an emphasis on time. And really, a lot of the Germanic countries, I think Switzerland is another example of that, where there's a little bit more flexibility in the United States, perhaps. And I think it also depends on geographically where we're talking about. For example, in a place like Los Angeles or New York, the idea of being late to a meeting isn't beyond the realm of possibility, given traffic and the overcrowded nature sometimes of public transportation and things like that. So there might be a little bit more flexibility there. Whereas in German society, and I think to a significant degree as well, Japanese society, there's a lot more of an emphasis of you got to be there on time, and it's a great insult if you're not there on time. A lack of planning on your behalf does not bode well for our interaction, basically, in a lot of those societies. So then Germany and the US are considered low context communication societies, whereas Japan, oops, there's a bit of a typo there. Japan is a high context communication society. My apologies for the error there. So meaning is reliant on the verbal message in the United States and Germany. People tend to be very precise about the way that they convey their messages, and there's a lot of apologies that happen in the event that uh, meaning is incorrectly communicated in the context of German or American social interactions. Whereas in places like Japan, which have a lot of high context, meaning can be derived from the context of the situation. Okay? Nonverbal communication is considered relatively low importance in Germany and the United States, whereas it's far more important in Japanese society for there to be a conveyance of information from nonverbal means. And in societies like Germany and the United States, silence is to a large degree avoided, and it can be very uncomfortable, especially if you're a great example of this would be going on a date in American society. There are periods of silence sometimes between individuals getting to know one another for the first time, and that can be very awkward in American society, whereas silence is oftentimes very normal in a lot of the high context communication style countries like Japan, and just, sitting and being with another person oftentimes conveys a lot of information that isn't necessarily needing to be expressed in a verbal manner. Canada and the United States are also very low face concern societies where conflict and disagreement is seen as constructive. The idea of being criticized, depending on the nature of the criticism, can be seen as constructive criticism, that it's something that will help to make you have a better product or have a better outcome in the future. And the only concern there is for self-face. You don't want to be embarrassed yourself, so you behave in ways that prevents you from being in a embarrassing situation, basically. Whereas countries like China and Korea, and of course Japan, there is a high degree of face, where conflict and disagreement is seen as potentially threatening and as something that you'd want to avoid. And there's a lot of concern for mutual or the face of the other. You want to save the embarrassment of others as much as possible in these sorts of contexts. Okay, so that is essentially a breakdown here of all the different types of things that may be a topic of consideration for understanding interactions. So, in general, let's talk a little bit about the different kind of clusters that are around the globe in terms of how communication and perception and behaviors and value systems play out in an intercultural context. So let's start with the Anglo cluster, which includes the United States, as well as the other English-speaking countries around the world, Australia, Ireland, of course, the United Kingdom, and places like that. And all the members of the cluster, first and foremost, that kind of give context to it, they're all developed nations, right? And they predominantly speak one language, the English language. And so a major characteristic in these societies, again, as we've kind of emphasized and mentioned, there's more of an individualistic approach to interactions with one another. There's performance-based orientation and a forward-looking perspective. And the idea is that these are very meritocratic societies. Rewards are the result of merit, and there is less of a dependence on formal rules and established procedures within the context of communications and in terms of professional settings and things like that. Furthermore, gender equality is valued to a significant degree, but we also have to note that in practice, a lot of these countries are also fairly male-dominated in many respects as well. So that is something to kind of bear in mind. And we can kind of contrast that with the Latin European cluster. Again, a distinctive feature of Latin Europe and them as a group is reliance on the state to provide a wide range of social support services. So there tends to be more of this orientation towards collectivism over individualism. And gender equality is actually considered among the lowest levels in that particular cluster. Furthermore, power distance was the highest score in the Latin Europe cluster. Okay. Moving a bit to the north, the Nordic European cluster. There's a very high degree of gender equality and orientation on the future, as well as uncertainty avoidance in a lot of the Nordic countries. There's an underplaying of things like assertiveness and familial and masculine authority and things like that, with more of an emphasis on things like certainty and social unity and cooperation in a lot of different contexts. Furthermore, the welfare state is found in pretty much all the Nordic nations and may contribute to the cluster's low performance orientation scores compared to other parts of Europe. For example, moving on to the Germanic European cluster, where there's a lot of an emphasis on assertiveness and uncertainty avoidance and power distance. There generally are lower scores on gender in these clusters. There's a lot of self-reliance, and there's well-defined rules and standards that are the basis for a lot of the interaction that takes place. A lot more of an emphasis on the notion of masculinity. And there's a lot of assertiveness in these countries. There's a significant amount of technological and technocratic orientation as well that is really emphasizing the achievement of things and acquisition of things, in this case, using technology to a large degree to be able to acquire it. Right, and then we can kind of contrast this with the Eastern European cluster, where there is a little bit more of an emphasis and a preference for a lot more vertical integration and hierarchical organizational leadership practices and things like that. So there is a lot of, perhaps not necessarily as a whole society, but as far as an in-group, there's a lot more in-group collectivism and a lot more of an emphasis on getting along and coming to compromise as opposed to competition and making certain types of achievement. Gender equality is a hallmark of a lot of Eastern Europe as well, with a high tolerance for uncertainty. Um, it's also useful to note that many of the nations in this cluster were once part of either the former Soviet Union or the Eastern Bloc countries under the Warsaw Pact. So there's that bit of an emphasis on collectivism that comes from the former communist system that was put in place. Okay. So now let's fly to the other side of the world and take a look at the Latin American cluster next. So as far as Latin America is concerned, there does tend to be a degree of paternalism. And that's sort of the central theme in terms of the perception of a lot of Latin American countries, with a desire to sustain personal social status, kind of driving a lot of intercultural interactions and things like that. And there's a pretty good predilection for in-group collectivism in Latin America as well as a sense of fatalism that comes from a pretty significant adherence to Roman Catholic perspectives on the way that the world works. And so, a lot of Latin Americans tend to prefer to live in the present rather than necessarily planning for the future as central to the understanding of how they're going to go about living their lives. Okay. So now let's go to the other side of the world again, to the Middle Eastern cluster. Again, this is all from the Globe study that we were discussing earlier, and the general notion that in the Middle East there is a common sense of historical, religious, and socio-cultural heritage. Arabic is the most common language in the Middle East. Um, you know, uh, Islam is the dominant religion. Now, that's not to say that Turkey doesn't speak Turkish, and of course, the Ottoman Empire was sort of a driving force in the more modern sense of what happened in the Middle East. But yeah, Arabic and Islam tend to be very significant cultural components of these countries. And as such, there's a very strong degree of in-group collectivism. There's a lot of an emphasis on the family and attachments to other groups, such as your tribe or your sect of your religion or your village or your neighborhood, perhaps in an academic setting, your classmates. And there is a very strong sense of very well-defined power distance hierarchies in many of the relationships and the interactions that take place in the Middle East. The Middle Eastern cluster tends to have very distinct gender roles. Masculinity tends to be the predominant approach or role within a lot of professional settings. And of course, many institutionalized values can also be attributed to the Quran, which teaches that leadership authority should be respected. And the Quran also provides a very clear definition of the different roles for men and women within society. So next up, we also have the South Asian cluster. So this is going to include countries, in the southern part of the. Oops, I need to get my notes here. 1 second. Okay, so as far as the South Asia cluster, there tends to be a bit of a preference in that society for a little bit more of a social hierarchy. With a tendency towards male domination. So within the workforce, women have commonly sort of had to rely on family connections or a really lengthy work history in order to be able to compete with their male counterparts. And in a lot of South Asian societies, women are seen as having, outside accomplishments, but are also expected to concurrently have very strong family ties. So we can kind of contrast that with the Confucian Asian cluster, where there's sort of that pervasive influence of Chinese history and Confucianism on the development of a lot of these different countries. And Confucianism, it contributes to the contemporary practice of a very strong societal and in-group emphasis on collectivism and collective performance. Um, so rewards are associated less with individual achievement and more with the attainment of collective goals in a lot of these societies. And of course, the notion of face and face work is also very central to these societies as well. But it's also something that pervades a lot of other societies as well. Face is your public identity. Face is acquired and it can be lost, and it's maintained through social interactions. And the process of acquiring face is referred to as face work. So face work consists of those actions that kind of engage you in the acquisition and maintenance of face, for you to, or perhaps to give face to somebody else in some contexts as well. So face and face work are influenced by cultural values, and they kind of vary across different cultures, and the way that you can achieve face is a little bit different based on the society that we're talking about. And in individualistic cultures, a person's face is usually going to be derived from his or her own self-effort, and it's usually going to be independent of others, right? Which is, I think, why a lot of Americans are very opposed to the idea of things like letters of reference, which I think makes for a lot of awkward social interactions, because Americans expect their own achievements to speak for themselves. Why do we need somebody else to vouch for us in terms of our performance at the workplace, for example? Versus collectivist cultures, where group membership is normally going to be the primary source of identity and status, right? So being a part of certain groups is going to be a big part of how you build face and how you engage in face work to be able to get a high degree of respect in those sorts of contexts. There are also varying attitudes as to essentially what represents face and how face work is conducted. And it has a very noticeable effect on how a culture views and approaches conflict and things like that, right? So a lot of individuals in high face value societies will tend to avoid conflict as much as possible, seeking social harmony instead as an effort to try to save face, not only for themselves, but for other individuals. So, these differences between face and face work across cultures are basically going to be a function of their different cultural values ultimately. And that's going to provide the context for the extent to which the face is going to be a major component in how a person views themselves and how they view other people within the context of societies. So, these are some of the different values that are looked at and have to be addressed and understood within the context of intercultural relations, right? If you're going to be doing business with individuals from different parts of the world, these different clusters that we talked about, these are the kinds of things that you have to recognize is part and parcel of their culture and kind of the expectations that are placed on their society, as well as the social interactions that they have with one another within their cultural contexts. And in order for intercultural communications to work and to be able to foster a degree of workability, I suppose we can say, in a cultural context and especially a professional cultural context. You have to be able to acknowledge these things and to be able to come to some sort of a compromise on the different values that are going to be emphasized in the interactions that take place. So thank you so much for sitting through this lecture. I hope you'll join me again for the next one, which is going to be all about a person's sense of identity, which I think is going to be a very fascinating topic of discussion.